Yes.
Think we're live. Hello, welcome to Degrowth Talks, Unmuted. This is the new series of Degrowth Talks, organized by Research in Degrowth and the Summer School, Barcelona Summer School. And we are, basically we're continuing the Degrowth Talks format, which has been already taking place in the last 2 months. And it came a bit in the out of the situation that we organized the summer school, the Degrowth Summer School, and due to the pandemic, it is not taking place this year. We had to cancel it. We had to change our plans, and also as the UK Degrowth Summer School had to switch online, and the result is a webinar series, and with the idea to at least use this moment of rupture and to at least have some more online organizing and online debates, and also try to have debates on degrowth and like using the opportunities of online communication and being able to have debates. So basically that is the focus of this series, that we want to have a debate between degrowth and movements, alliances, also outside of the degrowth community. And we try to especially focus on alliances and degrowth movements. So that's basically the talk of the day. We want to focus on global protests, and we have 4 invited speakers. So yeah.
Okay, so we can move on with this presentation of the format. So we're going to have 4 short presentations from each speaker, lasting 10 to 15 minutes. And later we're going to open up the discussion to questions. So please, if you're watching this live, send us all your questions. Max here, me and Max are going to be moderating. I'm Steph and Max.
Yeah.
And
we have Tatiana.
And Tati, yeah, is also, there's 3 of us organizing, so Tati is helping on the technical support. So please send us questions. We've got here our YouTube streamed here next to us, so please send us questions and we'll pose them to the speakers after the presentations. And that's it, I think. Do you want to do a brief presentation on the panel, Max?
Yes, we're gonna have 4 perspectives. We're gonna hear about first from Donatella Della Porta about especially social movements in times of the pandemic. We're gonna hear from Sara about the degrowth movement and the connection to climate justice movements from more European perspective. And then we have Gabriela, who is also part of the UK organizing team, of the Degrowth Summer School organizing team and the Degrowth talks, and who is gonna present us the perspective of the Chile movement and the Chile protest movement, the recent feminist and anti-capitalist uprisings. And then we have Hala from Sudan, who is currently in Uganda and presenting us a perspective of the women in the uprising of the Sudan, in the recent uprising of the Sudan. And we would like to have to explore the connections of these different perspectives and maybe commonalities. What are the discussions that you see currently important, and how just to make sense out of these connections. And yeah, as Steph already said, we're gonna have this live chat. If any one of you watching wants to participate in asking us questions and to the speakers, go ahead, and I'll be watching the live chat. And I think we can start off.
Yeah. So I'll start presenting the first speaker, Donatella Della Porta. So Donatella is a professor in political science and sociology at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. She leads the Center on Social Movement Studies, Cosmos, and her research focuses on social movements, political violence, terrorism, corruption, the police and protest. She works also extensively on democracy, civil society participation, democratization processes in Europe, Middle East, Latin America, and Asia. And she's also just published a book on new social movements. Sorry, I wrote that very fast and can't read it now. Donatella, can you present your book, please?
Yes. Thank you for this presentation. The title of the book is How Social Movements Can Save Democracy. And I think that this is published by Polity Press, and just wanted to cite this because it will be a big part of my short introduction. So, thank you for this invitation. And I think that the notions of alliance that we have chosen as focus for this debate today is a very central challenge for social movements, with however also opportunities that emerged in 2019, and I guess my colleagues are going to talk more about this, talking about Chile and Sudan, but also during the pandemic time. So I think that, of course, 10 minutes are too short to go in depth in all the issues related with the alliances, but I think that we can conceptualize alliances as relevant at different levels. So across movements, it's very important. You mentioned in the introductions alliances of degrowth and climate justice movements, and these are already movements that try to combine appeal to environmental protections with claims on social justice. So they put the basis for a broadening of alliances rather than single issues vision of social movements as focusing on different topics, the environment, the women, and so on. I think nowadays, 2019 already, but also with the development of the climate justice movement, there have been attempts at the level of the framing of the discourse, but also in the development of organizational networks toward bridging different type of movements and concerns. So across movements is an important challenge, and it is a challenge that is more and more relevant now as the pandemic has at the same time increased problems related with social inequalities and increased problems related with environmental issues. But there are also various type of I can say challenges in the internal compositions of these movements that have to be addressed, that are potentially enriching the movements, but that are also sources of potential divisions. So broadening the movements, it means also there are a lot of diversities in terms of the social basis of these movements. So once the environmental movement was considered to be as quite middle class, this is no longer the case with the environmentalism of the poor and environmental justice. But it is true that there is also still the need to bridge social basis of different streams of these movements. There is also a need to convergence in terms of generations, because different movements have been built also around different generations of activists. And what we see now with the movement for Black Lives Matter, with the Fridays for Futures, with Extinction Rebellion, with many, with Ni Una Menos on the women's movement side, is a strong participation of young people. And this, I think, is extremely positive in order to open, to broaden the basis of these movements. But it also brings about the need to reflect around the constructions of alliances across the generations. There is an issue of countries, so how discourses diffuse, because what we have seen is that while in the beginning of the millennium, with the global justice movements, the spreading of protest worldwide was happening through the organizations of global events. Anti-austerity protests a decade later have shown the difficulties of keeping this level of transnationalizations of struggles. The autumn of 2019 has been a moment in which there has been a lot of cross-national solidarities among movements in different countries, in different continents, but still the challenge of bridging and building alliances across movements that are often rooted at the local level is open. And I think in the environmental movements, the sort of divisions that have characterized also the development of the movement on climate, with the split in Copenhagen and later on within environmental organizations, is also an issue which I think needs to be addressed when thinking about alliances. So it is alliances across movements, across generations, across classes, across other type of differences. So the frames of intersectionality is also relevant in this respect. And what I think is important in this moment, looking at the mobilizations during the pandemics, is that movements can be carriers of alliances, not only in the streets, but also through the capacity of social movements to become carriers of emergent norms, norms and values. So the capacity to develop an alternative knowledge and the way of thinking another world, thinking a different future that is all the more needed. So what we saw during the pandemics has been potentials for the constructions of these alliances, I think, because we have seen in the beginning, what we saw was going to be a big challenge for the movement, the lockdown, the suffering related with the pandemic, especially in the weakest social groups. We also, as scholars of social movements, had thought that this could go in the directions of suspending democracy, suspending social mobilizations, and so on. And instead, we started to see immediately protests on issues of public health and social rights, on issues of workers' rights, on issues of democracies, and on issues of degrowth, on the rethinking of the type of movement that and the type of future that we need to imagine if we want to move beyond the pandemic time with progressive visions. So we thought the world was going to be closed for movements. We thought the 2019 movements in the fall were suspended, but in reality we saw a sort of new wave of movements with innovative forms of protest, online but also offline, a new critical type of mutualism, so the capacity to develop very grassroots forms of self-help that were not just oriented to help, but were oriented to mobilize and to spread a different type of consciousness. And in all of these type of events, what we saw has been also the constructions of a different type of knowledge. So in these forms of protest, we have seen environmental issues already bridged with others, because the pandemic has meant the high visibility of the ways in which social inequalities and environmental distractions has made the virus more lethal and stronger. So we have immediately observed that the pandemic developed especially under some conditions of environmental destroyals of the environment. Climate change has proved to be quite relevant, but also that the lethality and the ways in which the virus has hit different social groups has been also related with not only the spread of social inequalities, but also the specific conditions of pollutions, environmental pollutions in different type of areas. So we have been seen during the pandemic a development of the protest repertoires made of live stream protests, digital rallies, virtual marches, and online petitions. But we have seen also bike caravan, car caravans, walkouts, distanced demos, sit-ins, boycott, and so on, with a lot of creativity by the activists. So, for instance, the fifth global strike of Fridays for Futures went online. But it was a moment in which not only visibility was maintained, but also occasions for discussing and developing alternative future. Besides the protest in the streets, people have mobilized to distribute food, medicine, to develop alternative forms of productions of, for instance, healthy food. Critical consumptions has been also widespread. And I think in all of these activities, what has been pointed at is not only the distributions of services, but also the need to imagine alternative forms of life. And what I think is also very important when thinking about alliances of these different movements is the potential to construct alternative knowledge. So activists have been also in lockdown, but in many cases they have not been just waiting for transformations, but they have been active also in thinking, in producing knowledge about how environmental problems intersects with violence on women, with ethnic and racist development in the societies. So I think this has reactivated some existing organizations, created new grassroots groups in which these issues on which to build alliances have been very central. And I think that's building up upon previous movements that had also developed alternative forms of mutualist support, but also alternative forms of knowledge constructions. The mobilizations of a new generations has also constituted innovations. Still, and I want to finish on this, I think that there are at the same time challenges to what has been already thematized in the past as convergence de lutte, convergences of the different type of struggles. Still, it is a moment in which the pandemic itself has created a lot of scapegoats and pushed towards also quite selfish type of reactions. The poorest, the minority groups, those who live under more difficult environmental conditions, have been often considered as responsible either for the spreading of the virus or for their own bad health conditions. And there has been also a trend towards sort of exclusive nationalist developments with the closing of borders, meaning also the exclusions of the others, which has been used in different ways, very strongly in the United States, for instance, but also in countries like Hungary and other countries led by populist right-wing groups in order to increase the racist type of tendencies. And there is also nowadays a strong also push towards increasing or returning to economic growth as a way to address the economic crisis that has followed up on the pandemics and the lockdown. So to counterpose the environmental type of concerns to the concerns with growth, economic growth. So there has been also decisions which have been made by governments to suspend all rules that could protect the environment in order to restart the economy. And I think there is also a trend in cultural terms, an aspiration by the people to go back to normal. And so I think these are all challenges that movements have to address. On the other side, and to close on a more optimistic note, I think that there are also opportunities open. So first of all, the pandemic has shown that the world as it was organized and the power that the politicians that were in power were not able to address, to avoid and then address a big crisis. Is what in sociology is often called a critical juncture. So it's a moment in which there is the perceptions that the world as it was is responsible for the spreading and the consequences of the pandemics. Many people and many actors said we cannot go back to normality because there is no normality to go back to. This, I think, opens up some discursive opportunities for proposals for changes. And also social movements could be extremely helpful as actors for changes, because one of the elements that the pandemic stresses is also that you cannot separate the responses in the different fields, so that you cannot specialize knowledge in different disciplines, that you cannot separate changes in different policies areas, but that you have to address in order to understand what's happening and especially how to overcome this. You need the creations of broad public spheres, of arenas in which different groups can converge and develop an alternative. And I think that this discursive type of opportunities, together with the very widespread disappointment and outrage against the system that has been shown in crisis, is something that we have seen in the Black Lives Matter movement end of May and nowadays, is capable of creating a moment of protest in which different actors converged. And so I think this is the opportunities. But I would stop here and look forward to the debate. I think you have to switch on.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, I'll also remind people, if you have questions, start posting them on YouTube, and later we'll open up the discussion. So, next speaker.
Wait,
What, sorry?
I think the screen has to share. Anyway.
Screen has to share. Oh, it's fine like this. Oh, yeah. Tati. Oh no, because it's later. But oops. So technical issues. So second speaker. So the next speaker is Sara from. So Sara has been a climate justice activist for several years, and now she's a member of R&D. She's involved in local grassroots groups as well as international alliances. And she's researched degrowth as a social movement in her Master's in Environmental Studies and Sustainability Science at Lund University. So Sara, I open up the panel for you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm quite humbled to be here on this great panel. I'm also especially humbled and thankful for having a all-female panel. So I think that's absolutely wonderful and much needed. And I will start my intervention, or will talk in my intervention, from a point of view that comes as someone being deeply concerned with multitude of injustices that we have right now in the world, and a deep love for nature. So I personally feel very home to the climate justice movement and also the degrowth movement. So I want to cover both of these movements in about the next 15 minutes. So with our current global CO2 emissions levels and the tendency of the main emitters to follow the path of business as usual, we will not be able to stop the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. I think that's very clear for now, or by now, which means that a future full of uncertainty about the scale of the devastating and irreversible effects of climate change for all life on the planet is basically ahead on us. So while the climate crisis ultimately concerns us all, it, however, very disproportionately affects different parts of society. And this basically is the core notion of climate justice. Those who are least responsible for the climate crisis will, and are already suffering its worst consequences. This holds true, firstly, for future generations, so my grandchildren, your grandchildren, our children worldwide, and then secondly, also for vulnerable communities, such as global people in the global south, but also low-income communities and people of color in industrialized countries in the global north. So this being said, it is the rich industrialized countries that are responsible for the climate crisis, historically, but also morally. The richest countries of the world are home to half of the world population, but they emit 86% of CO2 emissions. So climate justice is the understanding that this historical responsibility of countries in the global north means that the shift to a low carbon economy also has to first and foremost come from these very countries. And this shift needs to come in form of a just transformation that leaves no one behind. Furthermore, a process of decolonialization has to happen in order to cut the ties of utterly imbalanced power relations that white elites use to oppress marginalized and vulnerable communities. This colonialization allows for the rich countries to outsource environmental impacts to and exploit natural resources and human bodies from territories in the global south. Tatjana, I think you can switch off the slide too. So yeah, great, thank you so much. So the climate justice movement historically has its roots in the experiences of the broader environmental justice movement that arose in the US in about the 1980s among communities of color in general, and then indigenous communities in particular. Generally, one can say that the fights of climate justice movements are rooted in very specific struggles. Those of frontline communities and their allies fighting against, for instance, extractivism, mega projects, industrial agriculture, and so on, with a focus on the effects of the climate crisis. Examples for Europe, which I would include and that I know of very personally, as the German alliance Ende Gelände, fighting for the closure of German lignite mines, and the newly built coal power plant called Datteln 4, which they're mostly known for. And then in Spain, many struggles evolve, for instance, around fossil fuel tourism that heavily heats up the planet and threatens the livelihoods of people living in these overcrowded areas. Some other climate justice groups are also making more broader demands for systemic change. This usually comes from a very extensive structural analysis of the root cause of the specific struggles. A popular slogan, which I'm sure some of you already heard of, is the narrative this narrative is system change, not climate change. So let me introduce you to four main claims that I want to expand on now. First, concepts of climate justice and degrowth are highly interlinked. So similar to climate justice, degrowth combines environmental concerns with social justice demands, as Donatella also already mentioned in her intervention. Climate justice focuses on the responsibility of the high-emitting industrialized countries, and so does also degrowth, as it is explicitly, and this I really want to stress, a concept that is designed in and thought for the global north. Degrowth, with one of its core elements to strive for a reduction of material throughput in the global north, is thus a prerequisite, in my opinion, for the achievement of climate justice on a global scale. It is therefore probably not a surprise that the movement heavily overlaps, especially when we look at the people involved. Many people that are considering themselves as climate justice activists also consider themselves, or rather the way around, people that are part of the degrowth community and activists oftentimes consider themselves also part of the climate justice movement. Which brings me then to my next claim. The degrowth movement would benefit from increased engagement with climate justice activism. So degrowth is a vision for the socio-ecological transformation and the good life for all. The degrowth movement, which is starting to be more diverse and oriented towards different forms of activism, not only scholar activism, which I saw basically as one of the heaviest forms of engagement so far. So the degrowth movement becomes more diverse in this, and I see this as one of the core characteristics for a transformative social movement. The concept of degrowth is a very broad vision. It accommodates a range of different aspects for a good life for all. Its complexity and its plurality are for me one of the core elements of the relevance and the beauty of degrowth. However, this complexity sometimes also makes it hard to transmit the message of degrowth. It might therefore not be really the best concept to mobilize people to really go on the streets. On the other hand, some argue that climate justice, in fact, is not so much about the goal itself, but it's rather about a process to strive for a more just and sustainable future. It therefore comes with a very clear call for action that is people power in the core of this very process. So the climate justice perspective can inspire an understanding of degrowth that might be more appealing to some. So an understanding of degrowth as a democratically led transformation to societies that are not based on the exploitation of nature, animal, and human beings. Yeah, and Tatjana, thanks. I think we are good with the slide because I don't have that much content on it, really. Thank you. So my third claim, and I'm sure you had some time to read it now, is going to be basically vice versa. So the climate justice and environmental activists could benefit from the degrowth perspective. Because as I mentioned before, climate justice struggles depart from very concrete cases. The struggles are usually against something. They're against a certain project, against the practice, or against the legislation, for instance. Degrowth, on the other hand, has a very visionary characteristics, and this could help the climate justice movement to have a clearer idea of the utopia which they are fighting for, and that entails, of course, climate justice. So from a strategic point of view, fighting for something makes our case more attractive for other people to adhere to our idea. Fighting for a vision also helps activists to not get distracted by a small win or a small lose on a very concrete case. Oftentimes, elites misuse this to make groups and movements believe that they are winning or losing the entire fight, while only they have succeeded or failed to shut down one single project. This is a seemingly easy way to silence people-powered resistance. The fight for climate justice and degrowth is a very long fight. We need to have hope, and we need to have a long breath to make our vision come true. Eric Olin Wright calls these kind of visions real utopias. So they help us to design alternatives and to also communicate them. So we can steer the political will to really change society and to challenge oppression. They can be very helpful to motivate people to imagine alternatives and then to make the first steps towards this alternative future, even if at the end, the very final destination doesn't look like the one that we departed from initially in our minds. Of course, there are groups within a climate justice movement, and as I mentioned before, that already asks for a systemic change under the slogan of system change and climate change, for instance. So the degrowth community, in my opinion, should be very humble and not to assume that other movements take over the term degrowth and shape their entire narrative around it. Assuming that degrowth can be an umbrella movement seems a bit of an arrogant assumption to me. So in the light of the current crisis, however, the ideas of degrowth are being heavily discussed, and Donatella mentioned this before too. So new people get engaged with the term and the ideas of degrowth. Many people, for instance, have now seen how a city with bikes instead of cars could look like, or a natural area that recovers slowly but surely from mass tourism. So having this vision that degrowth brings with it could be beneficial for the climate justice movement in the long run. And for this to be successful and for the entire movement to be successful, we need to escalate resistance so harmful industries and companies are shut down, which is my fourth and last claim. It is the capitalist, neoliberal economic system and its supporting pillars that have been driving us into a social and ecological disaster that we're in right now and have been already. However, the pandemic proved to us that this very system can indeed be switched off. Governments all around the world have shown us this. Dirty companies and entire industries came to stop. due to the emergency that has been caused by the virus, interventions we never deemed possible were all of a sudden possible. The climate crisis is an emergency that we've known about for many years. So even more powerful interventions should be done in face of this emergency. For social movements, this basically means that we have to acknowledge that governments are actually pretty powerful in shutting down companies and entire industries, and they might in fact be better at it than we are. So we need to make sure that these harmful companies and industries are shut down again. But this time in a more just and socially responsible way, of course. And for this, we need to build up pressure, and building up pressure will be a challenge. Several airline companies and other harmful enterprises have already signed kind of declarations with the governments to be bailed out. So it is rather today than tomorrow that we need to get mobilized again. The momentum of the climate movement in Europe, with a lot of debates around climate and high media attention, for instance, Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, among others, has been definitely interrupted by the pandemic. Some other governments even tried to take advantage of the messy times to silently push for projects or legislations without the public noticing it. For instance, last week, the German government decided to end coal by the ridiculously late date of 2038. And on top of that, the state says they're going to pay coal companies 4 billion euros for this deal. This basically is a slap in the face of the climate movement. After years of regular demonstrations, 2 years of mass mobilization through Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, continuous climate camps and blockades, the demands of the climate justice movement have again been ignored by politics. So we need to basically step up the game. We need to be even more coordinated. We need to be more strategic and bolder in our actions. So it is impossible for the elites to ignore us. This is also why me and my collective are part of By 2020 We Rise Up. By 2020 is a platform supported by 59 climate justice groups and other justice groups that are mostly based in Europe. Our aim is to be a bridge between different struggles, to help groups and movements escalate their actions and to strive towards a strategic and coordinated uprising. We don't want to go back to normal, and actually we cannot afford to go back to normal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sara, for your fantastic presentation. So again, I remind people to ask questions and we will discuss them later. So for the third panelist now, we have Hala Al-Karib. Hala was born and raised in Sudan and now lives in Uganda. She's the regional director of SIHA Network, a strategic initiative for women in the Horn of Africa. Her work focuses on women and girls' rights activism and social movements, as well as refugee, displacement, and minority community issues. She's worked in various international and regional organizations and institutions, and she's been working as a civil society activist and social and gender research practitioner in the Horn of Africa and East Africa for more than 20 years. And so, Hala, you may begin.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for reaching out to us and inviting us to your platform. So I was invited to speak specifically about, Sudanese women and their role on the Sudan uprising and their overall role on social movement in the country. And one of the things that I feel that I need to stress initially, that the Sudanese women participation in the protest has been, while it was celebrated, by many actors, the fact that Sudanese women has always been part of resistance and protest movements throughout Sudan modern history. But their participation, which played often critical role in political transformation that happens in the country, it was never documented, and actually it was most of the time erased from the memory of the political history. And I think the reason that the Sudanese women's participation in protest and in the resistance during the Sudan uprising has been recognized lately globally due to, definitely the social media and, which really enabled people to see women presence in various protests and demonstrations. But just a point that I wanted to stress, this did not happen out of nothing. It happened based on a very long history of political struggle, organizations. The women in Sudan, they have been part of social movements through trade unions, through predominantly female jobs, such as, Sudan has nurses societies since the 1950s, has female teachers associations, as early as the 1920s, and a very active women union, since the 1940s. So it's a sequence of engagements and attempt from the women and their resistance to address the injustices that's been happening towards them. And in the latest protest, the massive participation was reflection to the fact that women in Sudan were equally detained, tortured, beaten, and so on and so on. And this is why they formulate their agenda and their discourse, and they came out in masses. Basically, the other thing that I want to talk about is how the male-dominated political structures and political institutions in Sudan respond to women protesting. So when we as women participate in inclusive massive protests, which mobilize people across age, gender, or cultural background, and widely shared in the population, everyone collectively engaged towards a collective political goal. So our participation and engagement is typically being appreciated and encouraged. But when women protest on their own and for their own agenda, then it becomes a controversy. And just an example of that, I remember the young women when they were protesting against sexual violence and sexual harassment during the Khartoum sit-in. It was it brought great controversy, and many of the protesters, they were telling them that they are creating friction among the general protest, and that they should not actually raise the whole issue of sexual harassment and sexual violence during the sitting. Another example, when we protested issues like, the reform of family law, or, the commitments to women's rights or international agreements, or to end sexual violence, or access to resources and equal access to resources and economic developments, and it was perceived definitely as a threat to the male elites, and so we were typically scrutinized, and our protest is being dismissed, and this is an ongoing process that we have been going through. So basically, what I want to say that when women protesting based on self-driven agenda face much more obstacles, on the other hand, women can even be glorified, when they are part of a collective agenda, and they can, for example, call Kandakas or Queen, and so on. one of the things also that I remember that during our protest when we were calling for the legal reform and for the policy reform and for access to equal economic rights and for Sudan to ratify the Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, we had to justify ourselves to every single individual on the streets, like, why are you gathering here? Well, what's your problem? Is this the right time for you to come together? The country is going through difficult times and so on. And also, as women protesters, we have experienced sometimes hostility, often from some of the allies, male allies, and if in case there is another protest that was organized by other group and there is a women protest that's been prepared for weeks, it come always to the point that your protest is not important, you should allow the other protests to take place and so on. So this is some of the issues that women as protesters, facing in Sudan, and we are a country that's going at the moment through a very deep transformations after years and years of repressions. Women, they feel that they really need to take advantage of the civil space and to make their voices heard. But they're doing that against an extremely complex and difficult environment that try to push things back to the way they are. So it's, as I said earlier, it's just so typical, the participation and the engagement of women is largely appreciated when it's required to transform and to change regimes. But once that happens, it's women are being pushed back, and they are expecting things to go back to normal. I mean, as the situation coming back to normal, and in Sudan, when I say coming back to normal, as the government, transitional government was established, political changes been happening in the country. Women, the sympathy towards women is really reduced, and women's civic engagement is became more and more subject to scrutiny. So that's and just to give an example, after all the struggle that we have been through for years and years, there is no significant change up to now that we are as we expected or anticipated. Having said that, also speaking about the situation of the pandemic and the fact that, this made it much more difficult and complex for women, particularly women at the grassroots level, women IDPs, women vendors, women who are involved in marginal jobs and so on. So basically. Yeah, on the other, like, while over many times we have protested, to achieve transformation and change, we are still, despite everything, we are faced with resentment and with resistance. But the good point, the positive side is that the notion of the fact that we were able to protest and we were able to organize, it helped a lot in bringing women together. It helped a lot in formulating, in supporting the women of Sudan to formulate their agenda and to understand exactly what they are up against. So, so coming out of the broader protests that led to political change, and then coming towards the agenda of the women and the clarity that we are still are not really considered, when it comes to, to the gains of the transformation and everything. It's extremely helpful for the women to recognize that there is much more. There is a need to become more organized as movement and so on. And this is one of the most important lessons that we have learned through the process of engaging in the broader protest, is how to come back and collect our forces and recognize our agency and our power as women, and then start strategizing and organizing ourselves to protest for the issues that matter for us more, because it's the issues of discrimination. It becomes much more clearer at this point. So basically, this is a very general point, and I will be really happy to hear your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we'll move on to the last speaker. We've got Gabriela Cabaño. So yeah, Gabriela is a PhD researcher at LSE. She's currently living in Castro in the south of Chile, where she's doing her research on energy transitions in the context of ecological breakdown from a decolonial and feminist perspective. She participates in the Centro de Estudios Sociales de Chiloé and the Centro de Análisis Socioambiental, and is currently working on building a space for debate on degrowth from a Latin American perspective. Also, as Max has already mentioned, she's also been part of the organization of the UK Degrowth Summer School and UK Talks, Degrowth Talks. So yeah, welcome, Gabriela.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation and for the privilege of sharing this panel with these amazing women. So what I was asked to do today, and what I will try to do very briefly, is to go through the recent demonstrations in Chile, especially since last October. And I'm going to try to see and read the different claims and different results that have come from those protests under a degrowth perspective. Obviously, it hasn't been a revolt for degrowth, but I do think there is a lot to learn in the terms in which these protests have started to be thought of and debated from the critical perspective of degrowth. And having said that, I'm a researcher. I consider myself mostly as a part of the academic world, but I also participated actively as just like one more citizen that went to the streets and shared and took part of these demonstrations. So this is rather an experiment in putting a more academic lens of something that has been so far a very personal experience that I didn't live as a researcher, but as a person. So I'm just gonna briefly explain the historical context in case you're not familiar with Chile, and then I'm gonna make two maybe more theoretical points. One on the concept of dignity that I think is really interesting, and it talks a lot about care and talks a lot about other principles that are really important for degrowth. And then how there is affinity between this recent wave of social movement and all this idea of questioning that there is no alternative narrative, which I think is in line with what we want to do here. So just to begin, I'm going to share some pictures. Wait, now it's not allowing me to share only the, wait, I think I can do it. I'm going to show pictures of how it was for me. Okay, there you go. Can you see the pictures? Do you see? Okay, I think you will also see the ones in the background, and you'll see the chat, but that's fine. I can do it like this. So this is the picture of day one, on the first day after the fare of the subway was raised, and it says it's not just the fare, it's the precarization of life. So like less than 48 hours since the demonstration started, there was already this really deep diagnosis that the problem was way larger than inequality or that the life being more expensive, but actually life being more and more precarious. So this started happening in last October, since the 18th of October, but it's actually the result of 30 years of neoliberal austerity that has been a continuation of the neoliberal project that started in the dictatorship that was between 1973 and 1990. So we actually recovered democracy 30 years ago, but the situation hasn't really changed from how it was under the dictatorship. Actually, we have just continued the same model that is very extractivist, that has created huge ecological damage, that has created an economy oriented to exports in detriment of our ecological systems. So this has been increasing inequality very fast in the last 30 years. So in the numbers, Chile tends to look really well. It looks like we're growing, and we look like we are a rich country, but actually we are an extremely unequal country in which a small minority holds a lot of the wealth, and the large majority lives in increasing precariousness and huge debt. So these were already the claims in the first days. The idea of changing the constitution that has been a constraint for changing really the main problems and the main barriers that we see to addressing inequality. So this says a new constitution to assure a profound change.
Sorry, Gabriela, sorry to interrupt you. I think we can only see the gallery view of the pictures, so maybe you have to click on the picture.
Okay, wait. Thank you for telling me. Let me see, because before I could actually see the image, but it's very annoying that you can't see. Now it doesn't give me the choice of sharing. Okay, wait, if I do this, can you see it now?
Yep, that's better, yeah. If you enlarge the picture, maybe.
Okay, you're also going to see the camera, but that's fine. I think it should work. So, okay, I'm gonna move to the first one I was talking about. So this is the first one, right? So it's not just the fare, it's the precarity of life. This is on a new constitution. And this was, for instance, one of the, this was part of a huge intervention in a square in which people could write their demands. So here you can read all sorts of things, since changing the constitution, reducing the payment to members of parliament, anyway, like a series of lowering inequality, creating, nationalizing water, and a series of claims. And it's really important to put in context these demonstrations in the light of two movements that were coming from years before. One is the feminist movement that had an increase, especially since 2018, and the student movement that has been a main character of politics in Chile since at least 2006. A whole generation that has continued the struggle as they go up in the educational system, but also current high school students. So here is a very well-known female communist politician that it's no longer with us. She passed away, but she was one of the figures of, you have to fight like her, you have to fight like a woman. So this says we are an open wound that will leave a scar. And the idea of fighting against neoliberalism was really, really present. So this is, again, fight without fear, one of the street art that I could see. This, again, it says a new constitution. This was in the main street where we would march. This says to fight until it's worth living, with all this idea of dignity, right? We want a dignified life. We don't want just any life. We want a dignified life. This is the Constitution of 1918 in flames. This is one of my favorites. And here it says to draw, to scream. This says the neoliberal model is killing us. So again, very clear diagnosis on how what we were sold as a solution was actually the root of the problem. And here I think, even though it wasn't presented as we need degrowth, it was very clearly a discourse saying this thing you have sold us about growth being the solution to all our problems is just not true, right? Like we see the countries growing in numbers, but we are still living in very bad conditions. And another thing interesting that happened was the emergence of spaces like this that were called cabildos autoconvocados. So something like self-managed assemblies, popular assemblies that started to emerge even before a referendum for a new constitution was agreed. So after almost a month of demonstrations, the government and the parliament made a deal, and now we have a referendum by the end of the year in which we're going to decide on changing the constitution. It was going to be earlier, but it got postponed from the pandemic. But it was achieved after almost a month of like constant demonstrations and constantly being on the streets. And before that was approved, we still started to meet, even when it wasn't official, there was this sense that the process for changing the constitution had already started. So we would come together and debate and make proposals and identify what we needed to change from the constitution. So for instance, this one was on the environment, on water. And the issue of water has been huge in these spaces of debate. So this is basically how the streets looked like on an average day. This was probably a Friday were the busiest days. This is a view from the sky. And that's basically police brutality being faced. Some figures like Victor Jara, very present, this idea of being against violence. And again, this critique of capitalism, the people of the world are not a merchandise, down with the dictatorship of capital. So all sorts of arts being very anti-capitalist. And the plurinationality was also very important. So a reivindication of the need to acknowledge our indigenous people that have become completely marginalized from our constitution. They're not even named in it, and they have no form of autonomy. And this is from the end of the year, where we had the social climate conference that was going to happen at the same time that the COP25, but the COP moved to Madrid, and we did still nevertheless a social meeting, and this says free water for Chile. Again, water has been very, very present. So basically, the point I'm trying to do is that Chile is just one example of how the narrative of growth has been a failure, and how people notice, like when you tell them that the meaning of well-being is to have access to consumption, and then you have to go into debt to have more consumption, then it eventually blows up. And you have an extremely unequal and resented society like ours, in which we just feel the conditions under we live are not fair, and we want to gain back that dignity. And all these contradictions of extractivism are not only between global north and global south, not only between different continents, but also between different areas and places and regions of one same country, for instance. So the reivindication of ending with these sacrifice zones have been fundamental to this process. So like the art just has been amazing for me. I have learned a lot of like the sense of this political moment through what people are asking for. So again, the idea of dignity, I think, brings to the center how important care is for people. So the main issue is it's basically that our health system is insufficient and pensions are extremely low, and it's not possible to live with dignity in the way in which our system is organized now. So this whole reivindication of care, of putting people as having value in themselves at the center, in opposition to this neoliberal system that is always trying to extract value and export it in the sense of getting money back from sending things abroad. It's a rejection of that logic and asking again to our dignity as human beings to be acknowledged. So yeah, this is just more from the streets. This is from the feminist movement. You can see the women wearing red were doing a performance right there in which they were asking other women to join, which was very nice. And they were really main characters. And just to finish, because I know I only have a couple of minutes left, and I also want to hear and talk more with the other panelists, I just wanted to present briefly what happened on the 8th of March here in Castro, which is a small city in the south, where we had one of the largest demonstrations organized by women, like from local feminist movements. And here it says, even if they mutilate us, they're not going to shut us up, in her back. And it was amazing. I mean, for a small city, there was a huge, yeah, like a lot of people, and we took the streets and we cut the roads for many hours, and it was amazing. You can see there, in the main crossings, many women marching. Yeah, and for instance, I want Family Secrets to stop covering up for abusers, which is a huge issue here. So maybe I can go into more details of the pictures if you have any questions on particular events. But yeah, just wanted to finish with this picture that is really nice, just because it's beautiful. So yeah, that's all for now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Max, do you want to start asking the questions from the chat?
Yeah, we had two questions in the chat. The one was how to engage in the degrowth movement. I guess Sara and Gabriela, you must know a bit about that. Or maybe to frame it a bit different, what are the pathways of action, no? Like in these times, and of course it depends on the context and on your place. But if you see some like very at the moment, what do you see as the pathways of action in becoming engaged in activism? And the second question was about the role of colonialism and the history of colonialism in degrowth, and how to acknowledge that better, how to critically engage with this, and also like maybe also to ask in how far this this engagement has to be intensified. So these were questions from the chat. Feel free if you want to answer that, or also if you want to comment on each other's presentations. Whoever wants to speak. Have to unmute.
I can do it, but since I already spoke, maybe Sara, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I was trying to write down the questions quickly, but it was like so many things that I was like struggling. So probably I will just let me think. I'll start with the question probably on the degrowth movement, how to get engaged, and more generally, and maybe leave the colonization for later for when I took a breath on that one. So generally, on how to get engaged in degrowth movement, I don't think you only have to ask Gabriela and me, but I think Max, Steph, and Tatiana, I think you're also very good addressed to actually ask that. And I'm sure that at the end of the talk, there's a possibility to share some links on how to access some of the degrowth spaces. I would say it depends a bit on your preferences, of course. We have great summer schools that are in theory taking place in practice now being substituted by talks. So if that's your thing, I think you can reach out to the groups. Otherwise, if you're interested, for instance, into more like on theoretical reflections, you could, for instance, start with looking at reading groups and possible readings. There are many resources out there. And otherwise, if you're like more of a hands-on person, then I would also, I would also probably recommend to do what I'm doing and other people are also doing, basically, for instance, getting engaged in the climate justice movement, getting engaged in a movement that is very close to your heart, and also makes sense in the geographical space that you are in, and then try to get in there with the forms of activism that you feel comfortable with, and put a degrowth lens in it, and make sure that the vision and the ideas, the broader vision and ideas of degrowth are like part of the activism and the movement's ideas and broader analysis. I think that would be my comment on that. And then to the second question, or more in the pathway of action that we see for our territories that we're now representing. So I would say for Europe, as I tried to make a call in my last claim of my short intervention, I do see civil disobedience as a very strategic choice of action, if that's something that acknowledging, of course, also the limits that come with privileges in taking a part in such actions, for instance. But I do think when we look at the experiences from the climate justice movement in Germany, with like losing the fight for fast and urgent coal phase out, and other experiences in other countries, we do see that disruptive actions of civil disobedience that go beyond the demonstrations, which can unfortunately easily be ignored, is something that put back on the spot for on the climate issue, as it has been interrupted this momentum now with the pandemic. And of course, being aware of the limitations that a pandemic has brought to us, and that Donatella also mentioned to us, looking at physical distance and so on. I think I'll leave it here.
Yes. I also have some comment and following up on Sara's, because also thinking about issues on which a politics of alliances can be developed, and building up on all the very interesting interventions that have been presented today. I think that health issues could be very central, because one of the main cleavage in the past that has been built up is that, so on the one hand, you have new type of social movements concerned with the environment, and on the other hand, you have old social movements like labor movements, trade unions, and so on, that are instead concerned with issues of growth, economic growth. And I think these pictures is not very true also for the past, because on issues of health, environmentalists and trade unions have been very often on the same side, stressing the fact that industrial growth has negative consequences, first of all for the workers of some of the most polluting ways of productions, of the most polluting industries and so on. And I think that these potentials for alliances has emerged in the pandemics, where also issues that have been mentioned later on, for instance, on Chile, access to water, access to a clean environment, overcoming the challenge of overcrowded spaces. These are all elements in which I think one could also construct alliances between different types of movements. And health is something very central also for many of the protests on climate justice. Environmental justice has been building on the issues of unhealthy environment. And I think that degrowth is an important answer to the unhealthy things. And I was thinking about it also when Sara was mentioning that in the emergencies, degrowth happened because it was needed for health emergency reasons. And of course, that was a very unequal type of sort of degrowth, because it was hitting especially some social groups. But it also shows that in emergencies and in the framing of emergencies, health issues are quite resonant with the assessment of risks by the people. So Sara was saying the pandemic has produced immediate reactions, while climate change, that is making probably the same number of more deaths than the environmental pollutions, receive an answer that environmental pollution doesn't. And I think that in terms of framing, it is important to reflect on the ways in which these different type of emergencies have been presented, and thinking in terms of how to trigger more attentions to climate change and the need for degrowth that is as killing as the pandemics, but is having less resonance. Just this.
Okay.
Hala, do you want to say something? Because we don't see you.
Well, maybe I will respond to the questions on colonialism. I mean, basically, I mean, the colonial states, what they did they built the colonials, they built the states that's actually fits into what they need, and across Africa, and and by the time they left out, and the states was handed into national, to the nationalists or the national governments. The whole continent has been trapped, and is still living through the post-colonial era in terms of, absolute, they made sure that all the resources are being controlled, and as well as, the political will and decisions. So it has been an extreme dilemma for the continent generally, in terms of how can we reconstruct a state that actually live to our expectations and our need in that part of the world, and so this has been the ongoing struggle. We're still living in the shadow of the colonial state, and dictated by, by the new colonialism institutions and so on, which is absolutely controlling our economy and so on. And speaking about my own country, at the moment, a country is extremely devastated after 30 years of being living under a very sort of totalitarian, terrorist, repressive regime that isolated and absolutely corrupt regime, and which is literally like mobs, and they took control of everything, and they knew how to manipulate and live alongside the demands of the international community, and respond to and find their ways and respond to the needs of the international community. So nobody cared about the impact of that regime and the damage that they have done, inside the countries in terms of war and polarizations and environmental extortions and all kind of things that's happening there. So, so what the reality that we walk up to is this absolute collapse, and then what kind of methodology and what kind of, of tools and strategies, we have to regain some control of our country. And it's still, this is in itself is a battle as well, because I mean, it's transformation is not happening in our side of the world miraculously. We are fully aware that this is going to be a very, very long struggle, and it will take time, for the external world to recognize that we should have the ability to craft our progress and complete our liberations, but that will take time. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, maybe I can complement the answers, talking a bit more about colonialism and decolonization as a political project. For me, at least, decolonization is at the heart of degrowth. It doesn't really make sense to talk about degrowth without a critique of colonialism in all its different shapes, including patriarchy, that it's also a form of colonialism. That's basically because you can't have growth without imposing your colonial extractive logic into another territory. I mean, there must be, to create that creation of value and accumulation, you need to impose colonial logics. And here, at least what I have seen in my fieldwork here in this region at the south of Chile, is also that colonialism maybe was built through the arrival of the Spanish Empire here, but it has been continuated by the national states. It hasn't been dismantled. And in a way, we are dependent and we are colonized both by transnational companies and through debt, but also at the local level, even at the sub-regional levels by the metropolis. So understanding colonialism as the main problem that drives environmental injustices, and what is pushing forward this imperial way of life as the main aspiration we must have, it's at the heart of degrowth. So for me, it's really both concepts really dialogue with each other very much. And at least here, the claim for ending with the sacrifice zones, that is a way we call to places in the country that have been completely destroyed due to extractive industries. The reclamation for justice and reparation for these areas has been also be key in the recent political debate. So yeah, I think there is also what Donatella was saying, has to do with health. So colonialism, it's affecting all areas of life and the possibility of the reproduction of life. So yeah, very important for how we think and understand degrowth.
Okay, thank you. So we've got lots more questions on the YouTube chat. So I'm going to try and maybe join two together now. Hopefully I'm not misinterpreting them. So one is, what do you think are the key success factors in big mobilizations for people? What motivated so many women to mobilize in the protest showed in Gabriela's town? And the second question is, how can we deal with the issue of capitalism being the origin of most of the problems of this discussion and the difficulty of transporting this message to a wider public? So yeah, considering maybe the fact that Gabriela's was precisely an example of this, of how a strong anti-capitalist message was communicated and mobilized a lot of people. Yeah, how do you think maybe are the strategies for doing this more often, more successfully? And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Especially maybe we've already spoken about it, especially in this moment of global pandemic, and perhaps, like Donatella said, we're at a critical juncture. So how can we exploit this better?
So this is
maybe I can, yeah, Gabriela, I'll direct it to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is just an extremely difficult question. And we have been talking about this with my friends, with all my comrades with whom I have participated in politics since I was in uni. And it's hard to say because, for instance, we never got the level of mobilization in the student movement in 2011 that was huge in itself. We didn't get anything closer to what happened in October in numbers, even though we were actively and extremely well organized and promoting an agenda for increasing the right to higher education, for instance. And suddenly, in just a couple of weeks, you had the entire country on the streets. And I mean, even my parents who had never been on the streets went to the streets. I mean, this was really, really a moment of coming together that broke generational barriers and made us have conversations that we couldn't have before. And I think in this, there is like a level of like, it's just unpredictable, you know. It's like you just are like, you do like iterations and you're like trying to provoke this like ignition of things. But at some point it happens and you can't really predict it. Like, for instance, in 2017, we had, no, 16. Only recently we had a campaign by the previous president to change the constitution, and she wanted to change it, and she did a whole campaign to make like local assemblies to talk about the constitution. And even having all that support and having also local NGOs working for the change of the constitution, we couldn't manage to have people talking about changing the constitution. And last year, after 2 weeks of being on the streets, they were selling the constitution on the streets, you know, like very cheaply, like very cheap formats of the constitution. So because people were so eager to read and understand what the constitution was. And for me, this was like, I don't understand. Like, I don't understand. And the problems we had in October were already there 3 or 4 years ago. Like there hasn't been a recent change or even a recent crisis. So I think my main learning from this has been, you need to be ready. The revolution will come at an unexpected time. And by then it's going to be really useful, all the things you have studied and learned and all the resources you have produced. And that proved to be really, really true. But at some level, I'm like, and this is still happening. So we are still seeing how far the wave is going. But yeah, I wish I knew and I could tell you like, this is what you have to do, but I can't.
Okay, so yeah, Sara, do you have something to say?
Yeah, just to add on that, I think also Hala has briefly mentioned it, the notion that many things do not come out of nothing, or these mobilizations don't come out of nothing. So from a European perspective, like one of the main mobilizations that have been quite impressive in the past 3 years has been the mobilization of Extinction Rebellion. And Extinction Rebellion also doesn't come out of nothing. It has been a work of like a small core group that have lots of experience working on like how to start this movement that mobilizes broader masses. So I think that, yeah, that supports the claim that the work that happens in the background and is oftentimes not be seen, if you are able to catch the right moment and then to implement all the things you've learned, that can be very fruitful. But at the same time, it is very unpredictable. And especially now in the times of the pandemic, of course, we don't know what happens next, what's around the corner in terms of like the spread of the virus in the different regions. So I think we have to be, very fast with this. And then a bit maybe to challenge also this idea of big mobilizations. What do we mean by that? What are we actually aiming for? Because when we look at strategies that one can have about the theory of change, one could be, and many people in social movements in Europe also support this, that you don't necessarily need millions of people on the street. You don't need 50% of population on the street. What you actually need is a critical mass of people that are actively supporting you. They're coming to your actions, they're coming to your demonstrations. But then if you have passive supporters, the people that are still at home, but they're with you in the case, that can be enough in cases to actually trigger the change that you're wanting to actually implement. So just on this notion on big mobilizations, does it have to be big mobilizations in terms of numbers, or does it have to be big mobilizations that are more like, or mobilizations that are able to bring you passive supporters? And then just one very brief comment that I really wanted to not miss is just the notion that has been mentioned before by Donatella in her intervention, that we have degrowth as seen happening in the emergency of the pandemic. I just would like to quickly comment on that I think we have to be very careful not to call it degrowth. Degrowth is a concept that entails a lot of ideas that are actually totally in contradiction with what has happened during the pandemic. And we want to prevent that this happens again. We want a just transition that brings us to a degrowth society.
Thank you, Sara.
I agree. I agree on that.
Wait.
I just meant that it was perceived as a sort of degrowth by necessity, or at least some emergence in the emergency. The growth was stopped, but I agree with you. It's another thing.
Okay, Hala, you have something to say?
Yes, I just to respond to the questions about, you know, how can people engage in protest, and you know, and I just based on our experience, because often, you know, as a community and a society who is experimenting with protest and democracy, after we earned the space after years and years of struggle, you know. And just as an example that many people, they did not think that grassroots women and women of the urban poor and women who live in urban slums, they will be interested in protesting, you know, on issues like access to justice. They would protest on issues of not to be criminalized, and they will protest for, you know, against, you know, all the, you know, ugly sort of practices that embedded in our legal framework by the patriarchal institutions. But they did, and they did. It's just basically through not only they did, they responded very, very quickly and in masses, as opposed to the elites, for example, who had to think a lot about their connections and relationships, you know, with those in control and those in government, and they have to balance things and things like that. So basically, I think it's really important for people to see themselves on the protest, and to feel that, you know, that they are doing what they can as long as the space is there, you know, to occupy it and so on. So this is just a quick response. I think the other thing is the confidence. I think, you know, just thinking about, you know, about Sudan at the moment, and people, they are really becoming more and more confident on their power and who they are and what they want. Although it's a bit naive, of course, you know, the situation is really, and what they are up against is far complex. But based on where they are at the moment and their capacity to push back, you know, that actually is really giving people way more confidence and understanding that civil actions and protests, it's something that we need to invest on and to be creative about. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, we would also be curious to hear if someone of you wants to elaborate a bit more on the processes that you experienced in terms of politicization in the movements, or for example in women movements, or in the environmental movements, where I think like recently you have new, for example, like looking at the climate justice movement, you have like the emergence of new movements and the youth, and how has this in a way politicized the claims of the movement or brought forward new movements. And we also had a question before in the chat that we left, we couldn't bring, and this was about the intersectionality of claims. So that we see that more and more some of these movements have like bring forward decolonial feminist and anti-racist claims. And in what form does this affect the mobilization, or what we see in the streets? And if it's not in the streets, maybe in other forms of mobilization. Just if you have some thoughts on that.
Directing the questions.
I think that all movements tend to change a lot during different moments in cycle of protests. So when you think in terms of politizations of a movement like the degrowth movements, I think one has to locate it within a broader perspective of how conditions of struggles are spreading in the societies. So I think that people are active not only in the street, but when you have a massive type of protest, movements change because they usually expand, new people participate, the state reacts, and one of the main ways through which politizations often happen is through repressive intervention by the state. So it is not always that movements are visible in the street, but in moments like the fall of 2019, or in moments like the May with the Black Lives Matter movements, I think there is a transformation of the movement inside. Very often there are new members that join, new generations, and there I think not only politizations happen, but also transformations in the discourses of the movements, innovation on the framing.
Okay, Hala.
I just want to talk a little bit about the, the politicization of and the depoliticization of the women movement. Just based on my experience, I think the women movement has been targeted, for years to become an apolitical movement, and this happens through, intentional NGOization of the women movement, at least in this part of the world where I live. I mean, I've talked earlier in my talking point that like when I look at the history of the women movement in my country, you could see that from the beginning, women were really organized in a way, in a very political way, so predominantly female jobs, women, they get together and they get organized as teachers or nurses or even women who are petty traders. They have their own way of coming together and things like that. And I think what happened, over the past 40 years, I think the women movement has been targeted by systemic NGOization. And this has, to a large extent, alienate a lot of women. And it also took a lot of agency and power from the women movement in this part of the world, and that's really a challenge. It became very business-like. It incorporated and became a ticking box, and so it became completely disconnected from the challenges of women and of grassroots women, of their creative and innovative ways of organizing and standing up to to patriarchy. I think what happened with the Sudan women protest is that there is new forms of activism and lack of fear of politicization within the women movement. That's something that definitely it's a good thing, and it's promising, and it needs to be supported, and it needs to be helped to grow. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, Sara?
I would maybe try to give a brief answer from my perspective on the question on plurality and intersectionality that might be demanded from feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial movements. So I do think in the climate justice movement as well, and as in the degrowth movement, there has been recently quite some discussion going on, and some more reflection going on the intersectionality of these two movements with feminist and decolonial struggles and anti-racist struggles. And I think also with the Black Lives Matters mobilizations now in the US that has brought again this topic very much on the table, making it visible and putting in the front this issue and the movement and demanding from the movements that they actually position themselves in case they haven't done it visibly before, which they should have. So I think that it is very, from an organizer perspective, I think it is one of the core elements of solidarity within between different movements, to basically, if there is a demonstration going on, for instance, from our climate justice collective, we had organizers of a LGBTQ protest approaching us, asking us if we would want to start a section in the demonstration, which would be like climate justice movement for gender LGBTQ issues. So I think it can be this very practical intervention, which means like being in solidarity. And then if you're coming to one of these protests, making sure that your claim is not at the center. It is not about you. It is about you being there, visible, supporting it, but it's not about you, especially if you're a white person joining a decolonial anti-racist protest, or if you're a straight person joining an LGBTQ protest. So I think making sure that, that you're there, you're supporting it, but your claim might not be at the center in this moment. And I think that's also the point that I wanted to make about degrowth, with degrowth being this vision, this broader idea that one could have of this utopia, but not being the core element of and trying to incorporate and trying to be an umbrella movement over all these different movements that are out there, and for themselves have to have a position and have to have their own claims in the discourse.
Yes, go ahead, Gabriela.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to touch on something that I couldn't do in my initial round, that I think maybe speaks to the question of politicization and how these movements evolve and change with time. So all this space of local organizing that really emerged and came together by the end of last year were just coming back to a scene because of the referendum that was going to happen in April, but they transformed quickly into nodes and into spaces of care and mutual aid in the face of the pandemic. So if you haven't heard, in the last few months, we have had like a deep crisis, especially on access to food. Access to food has been at the center of political discussion. And this is, well, it's related obviously with the lack of access to cash and with the fact that people are not getting income, but also with our deep problem of food sovereignty. So we export and we talk about ourselves as a food power in the world, but we export mainly like luxury foods like avocados. You might have eaten avocados from Chile, which is a tropical fruit, but we grow it in the desert, which is very silly, and obviously it creates all sorts of problems at the ecological level. And suddenly since people were organized and were asking and were saying, you know, we don't have food, we need to feed ourselves, how do we take care of each other? We actually are now starting to talk about food sovereignty and how we need to transform our food system. And we are talking about this issue in a very deeply political way, which is amazing because it's an overdue discussion that we didn't have. And it's also an issue of environmental justice again. So this is just one example of how the pandemic, when you can question it from a politically organized community, you can open these windows of debate that we hope are going to be transformed into policy. So I just wanted to give that example of how it's been taken by grassroots nodes of care and aid.
Thank you very much. So it's getting on for 8 o'clock, and I don't think we have any more questions on the YouTube chat, correct?
No.
Okay. So maybe do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, we would like to ask you if you want to make a closing statement, like a little take home or a thought you want to share with everyone before closing this session. We're really grateful that you could join this talk and to share your experiences. And I think there would have been so much more to discuss, but as we have to wrap up, we would just like to give you the word, each of you, and if you want to share something, whoever wants to start. If no one wants to start.
I would misuse the closing statement, and then the other three people have a bit more time. I would use the closing statement to actually thank you. Thank you for organizing the Degrowth talks. Thank you for having everyone join us. I think we need to visibilize activism and especially organizing that happens a bit more in the back. People that probably don't have their name that prominent on the next panel discussion flyer or something. I think it's a great work we're doing. I know you also do this without getting paid for it. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope that even though organizing is probably not the way to get the most recognition in our society, that is based on you need to have a proper job, you need to have I don't know, a lot of luxurious good. I think activism is worth to get yourself engaged in and commit some time to it. I think I would leave it here.
Well, I also want to thank you and to go back to the issues of this talk, saying that alliances are extremely important for social movements, and they are at the same time necessary for mobilizations and easier when mobilization is high. So it is a moment in which alliances can be developed because the movements are creating spaces in which activists from different background and movements and perspective converge. But it is also hard work, and I think that studying successes and failure from past movements is very important in order to reflect on how to transform possibilities in actual change.
I'd also like to say thank you very much for inviting me to your space. I'm really pleased and happy to meet you virtually and to meet all the speakers. It's such a fantastic opportunity to get to learn about you. And I think last word, I'll say that, protest and engaging in activism and social movement, there is a lot of education and learning as well. So we shouldn't be worried or afraid, of protesting and meeting each others and capitalizing on our power and experimenting with that. It's really critical. Yeah, thank you.
Well, yeah, very brief closing comment. Revolutions always seem impossible until they happen, and then they seem inevitable. And this is so true once you see one blowing up in your face. So don't lose hope, keep fighting. It's not time to go back to normal. We won't go back to normal because normal was the problem, as one of the interventions, artistic interventions in the streets of Santiago was saying last year. So just keep that in mind, and there is a lot we can learn from each other, not just from what it's considered academic knowledge, but what we learn in our everyday experiences, in our territories, and with our communities. So if you have some time you can spare, learn from there. And I also wanted to invite, I think I asked this to be put in the YouTube channel. There is a new initiative called Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, which is a proposal for a new form of society, a new way of living, a new civilization that has emerged from a very interesting effort from Latin America. And it's been trying to establish dialogues with other initiatives from other parts of the world. There was one session actually on Pacto Ecosocial del Sur and Green New Deal yesterday, which was super interesting. So I really invite you, if you want to learn things outside the typical proposals from the Global North, you can check this one out. And yeah, I think you will find it interesting. And thank you again to everyone, the organizers and the panelists.
Okay, thanks a lot to all the speakers. I think it's been a productive conversation in bringing together our experiences and our successes. And yeah, I think we'll leave it at that.
We'll be.
And yeah, next week we're going to do our second talk. The second talk is about community organizing. What was the title again?
So I think we will make the move from the protest perspective to the organizing. And I think it will directly link to where we stop now, unfortunately. I really liked how our conversation started, like from sharing different perspectives and to the issues of what actually makes people protest and politicize, and what actually are the moments later where you have to have a structure and the organizing mechanisms and strategies. And we will explore this a bit more with new speakers next week. And I really wish you a lot of good energy for the upcoming time. And thanks for sharing all these experiences, and I really learned a lot. And yeah, we'll leave it here.
Yeah, see you next week.
See you next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Hope to see
Thank
all
you.
of you offline sometimes.
Bye. Thank you. Yeah, same here.
Bye.